Hello, I'm Ryan, and welcome to my channel Analyze This, Mr. Bond, where I discuss the adventures of James Bond 007 and dig for what lies beneath the surface. When the news broke that Amazon was handing over creative control of the James Bond series to Amazon, I was in the middle of a vacation. I was really thrown for a loop at that point, but I didn't really want to disrupt my trip to rush out a take on it. And I came down sick and all this stuff happened. So it's given me a lot of time to just kind of sit and stew on the news. So this isn't a fresh take. This is a considered take on what's going on with the Bond series right now. These are my 007 takeaways about the Eon Productions Amazon transition and what that means for the series, what that means for Bond 26, and how we should feel about it, or at least how I feel about it. I'm not telling anyone how they should feel about the news. I have my own perspective on what this transition means for the series, what this transition means for the character, and what this transition means for me as a James Bond fan. So the first takeaway here is that the Bond series as we know it is over. I think some of us intuitively grasped that there really was a tectonic shift with the events of No Time to Die. No Time to Die was such a profound statement. It wasn't meant to be the end of a series. It was certainly teasing that James Bond would come back in some new form, but it very clearly felt like the culmination of a project that had taken many, many, many years. At the time, that felt like that just might be the project of the Daniel Craig Bond movies. However, it now feels like the end of a true era, the end of the Eon Productions era of Bond films. That's pretty monumental. Obviously, the Eon Productions run with James Bond has had many different flavors and shapes and modes. The Roger Moore era was distinctly different from the Pierce Brosnan era, which was distinctly different from the Daniel Craig era. These were all very distinctly different micro eras. But this sense that Eon Productions was the shepherd of the Bond series, they were kind of protecting Bond against the dangers of aggressive short-term thinking. That's now past. The creative team that shepherded the Bond films, this family of veteran Bond creative team personnel, is gone. And that's undoubtedly going to result in a difference in feel going forward for these movies, even if things are kept like the James Bond theme and the gun barrel logo and the core formula and everything like that. Something is definitely changing here. The personnel that created a level of continuity for these films has changed. So that's takeaway number one. The series as we knew it is over. Now, takeaway two is the clock is ticking. By that, I mean there is a limited window for Amazon to capitalize on its exclusive hold on the James Bond character. Casino Royale, the Ian Fleming novel, will enter the public domain in, a little over a decade, essentially. James Bond is going to start to become a character a little bit like Sherlock Holmes. He's going to become an icon where there can be many different takes on that character at once. Once that starts to enter the public domain, it doesn't mean everybody's going to be able to use the James Bond theme or the gun barrel logo. All those things are trademarks of the Eon Productions Bond series. That's a distinct DNA, but the character itself is going to start to have a life beyond the boundaries that the Eon Productions team had established. And maybe that was a factor in Barbara Broccoli's decision to really step back from the series at this point. With No Time to Die having completed a cycle and looking ahead to the future and just seeing that there was still just another big hurdle in sight. Maybe it was just best to leave her family's legacy here. I don't know. I'm not friends with Barbara Broccoli. She's not sharing with me her innermost thoughts about her feelings about the Bond legacy, but that does create some creative pressure. And doesn't just create creative pressure, it creates economic pressure. Amazon has spent quite a bit to acquire its stake in the James Bond series. First off, there was the acquisition of MGM, and that came at a price tag of around $8 billion. We've now heard that another billion was essentially spent to acquire creative control of the Bond series. Now, that's not all to say that full $9 billion is exclusively about Amazon trying to capture the power of Bond, that there aren't other incentives. MGM is not just James Bond. The revenue that they're getting back from that acquisition is not just through film production, but Bond is a big piece of that. And without a Bond movie coming out, you do lose some of the power of the broader Bond merchandising machine, this broader engine that is economic heavyweight in the space of blockbuster cinema. Amazon is also aware that there is this ticking clock. So I would say they're probably thinking in their mind that they have about 10 to 15 years to really capitalize on Bond in an exclusive way, to establish a new Bond, to really get the most return on that investment, and then probably continue to manage that license, but they will see a different landscape, in that post 15-year mark. Once the Bond starts to enter the public domain, once there are, things starting to crop up like, I don't know, random TV shows featuring a character named James Bond, things like that, that just start to enter the space and create avenues for new interpretations of the character that Amazon does not necessarily control. That's the thing we're going to start to see at that point. Amazon is acutely aware of that. So the pressure is on from Amazon's perspective to make the most of this in that 10 to 15 year period. So that brings me to point number 3. Amazon has never attempted anything quite like this before. Amazon has a pretty established track record right now as a producer of film and television, and there's a pretty diverse set of outputs in both camps. I don't want to pigeonhole what Amazon is doing in any way, shape, or form, but Amazon has never really taken on what is a cornerstone theatrical film franchise this way and really tried to capitalize on it. This is an acquisition for Amazon that is essentially the equivalent of Disney acquiring Star Wars from George Lucas. This is a monumental acquisition for Amazon. And we haven't really quite seen Amazon get control over one of these major series. There's going to be a multi-pronged Bond initiative here at Amazon to really maximize what Bond represents for them. But I think the closest we've kind of seen to something like this, where this pet project really getting a ton of investment and time, is probably Rings of Power, which is interesting. Amazon spent a lot of money to make Rings of Power. You can look up the news stories about that if you're really curious about the details. It's fascinating. If that is the model for what Bond becomes, it does make me a little bit nervous, but it's also apples and oranges because we're talking about something where, what you can do with the Lord of the Rings license as acquired by Amazon was very narrow. They focused exclusively in the television domain. The rights are still kind of split with other shareholders. additionally, there was never this sort of like theatrical release component. So it's hard to say that Rings of Power represents, Amazon's de facto approach to something like James Bond. I don't think James Bond as a series is something any studio really has an equivalent towards. This is a long-standing franchise, and that's the big difference. Is playing the James Bond game is playing a long game to a certain extent. Even if Amazon sees this as like a short-term investment of 10 to 15 years and isn't really thinking that far beyond that, it's still a longer-term play than just cranking out a few movies and seeing how things go. And, when you commit to James Bond, you're committing to a decades-long legacy for this character and what audiences expect around that. And all eyes are going to be on Amazon. Rings of Power was always kind of a niche project for real like fans of the Tolkienverse. It was never going to be this mass blockbuster that had everybody's eyes on it, like say, The Force Awakens did back when Disney launched that. I really think that this puts a lot of pressure on Amazon to figure out how they can establish themselves as a true film studio in this new decade that understands how the industry is working, how it's moving, and how their strategy needs to play into that. They're going to have to be really smart to, again, balance maximizing their return on their investment in Bond while also preserving what they're doing with Bond. The cautionary tale of what we've seen with things like Star Wars and Marvel on the Disney side in particular is the really big sense of burnout that just has kind of started to permeate the ether for things like, the Star Wars films and the Marvel films, despite initial levels of excitement. And Amazon has the opportunity here to sort of buck that trend, to really come out of the gate swinging with a new Bond movie that sustains a level of excitement enough to kind of pay off down the road. In other words, Amazon has to prove that they can do more than just short-term thinking, that they can think beyond just Bond 26, but really be thinking about what it means to be a caretaker of Bond 30 and how Bond 26 can't be so motivated by short-term gain that they kind of sacrifice Bond 30 on the altar of getting Bond 26 out there. The takeaway 4 is forget all the rules. The entire production team that has supported these Bond movies, people responsible for the casting, for the action, for the location scouting, for the screenwriting, for the approaches to overall brand management, that's all gone. If you followed the history of the Eon Productions Bond series, there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of protection Eon Productions did around Bond in the past to safeguard Bond from, short-term thinking. There was a lot of pressure at different points in the series to make the Bond series just like other popular series of its era. There was pressure to, cast very marquee stars as James Bond at different points in time. And what Eon Productions helped do was maintain a certain consistent ethos about how Bond movies were made. And we kind of have come to accept that as a norm. It's not necessarily a good or bad norm. It is just a norm. These norms no longer hold. So the expectation that, James Bond would be cast with a relatively unknown actor, well, that's out the door. Maybe Amazon will cast a big name star as James Bond. That is very possible. I think it's unlikely. I think it's unlikely for financial reasons. When you're signing someone up for a, 10 to 15 year project of movies involving a single character, you tend to want to get someone that is going to command a lower salary, but that by the time the series has come to full fruition, they've kind of matured alongside it, rather than coming in at a high bar right out of the gate, and then the ceiling only gets higher and higher from there. So it's financially advantageous for Amazon to find a Bond who is a little bit off the radar, isn't yet a marquee star with a marquee star's price tag. But we don't know what those decisions are going to be. The creative team and their ethos is gone. So the commitment to certain approaches to location shooting, to how locations come to be factored into a Bond film, that may all kind of go out the window. All these sensibilities might go out the window. So we have to prepare ourselves for a certain change in the series ethos a little bit, because those rules all don't apply. That's both frightening and exciting, because some people have rightly pointed out that the Eon Productions approach to making a Bond movie can be a little constrictive. Certainly, I've felt that way at different points in time. So now everything's on the table, because we really don't know what direction Amazon will go with things. But there's also danger in those rules being abandoned. What does it look like? Does Bond now just start to adopt the rules of blockbuster filmmaking in general, as opposed to its own particular ethos? Time will tell. That brings me to my next takeaway. The creative team is everything. We know that Amazon is looking for a producer to shepherd Bond at this point. This Kathleen Kennedy figure, this Kevin Feige, someone to really step in and fill the void left by Eon Productions to really manage what is a huge multi-year project. You really need someone at the center of that who is going to shepherd that, even if you bring in more specific creative voices, writers, directors, to help fill in the vision there. With this big sort of multi-year project, you need someone who is really steering what that roadmap is, setting guardrails for the overall project so that everybody can work together. I expect to hear very quickly who Amazon wants to shepherd Bond. That will give us our first clue of where Amazon is going with the series. Who does Amazon see as the new guardian of James Bond? Hopefully it's someone with a little domain expertise. The one thing that Eon Productions had that we came to rely on is decades of domain expertise. They knew this character. I think the one thing that I, as a fan, really just want to see and trust is that there is some domain expertise in what Amazon is going to do with this character. Somebody behind the scenes shepherding this project really needs to know the history of Bond from Fleming all the way down, and have a real sense of what motivates this character. Who they hire as the proper creative team, the director and the writers, that is going to be the next significant thing. The Bond series had already moved in the direction of being more of a director-led series in the past, decade plus with the Daniel Craig films. These were generally films where directors were taking more and more lead to define what these films were. Typically, it was Eon Productions taking the lead on what Bond stories were, but you really started to see in the Craig era, especially with, Michael G. Wilson kind of taking steps back in this process, the director and his writers taking lead to really flesh out the story, to really lean into that story development. Certainly saw that with Sam Mendes and John Logan, and you saw that during the Danny Boyle run, and then it ended with Cary Fukunaga being both a director and a writer, kind of pulling together all the drafts that had been written for No Time to Die thus far to really pull together some vision out of it. That was a very unique experience. Typically, Eon Productions took the lead on a lot of the story development pieces, and the director was really brought in to bring it to the screen. It shifted more towards a space where directors were really shaping what the movies would be. And I have to imagine that that is going to continue to be the case. That's just an easier model for development as opposed to kind of building your in-house shop of, essentially like applying a TV model to movies where you have a, staff of writers that are kind of working out scripts, and then you kind of hire a director to do an episode here or there. That's how TV shows work. It doesn't work as well with blockbuster cinema, where you really need a director to come in and, commit 2.5, 3 years of their time to shepherd this film. I expect that to continue to happen. So whoever Amazon hires as their producing lead and whoever Amazon hires as their first big director for Bond 26, that's going to really clue us into what Amazon is doing with this project. Now, my next takeaway is that Bond 26 will be huge. So if we look back at my earlier takeaway that the clock is ticking, Amazon feels that pressure. And Amazon feels the pressure that they need to establish credibility, and quickly. They've seen the response that's out there. They understand that they're facing a level of skepticism and they have to prove themselves. And they're going to make all the effort in the world to do that. I expect Bond 26 to be a huge rollout project. And I expect it to happen relatively quickly. I would think that we are looking at Bond 26 in the 2027 timeframe. I don't think 2026 is feasible. We're, partway through 2025. There's no director, there's no script, there's no locations, there's no creative team. All that machinery needs to be built up from scratch, and that takes a while. It's usually a pretty big production cycle to get, a story locked and figure out what the locations are and the set pieces are, so you can do the scouting and get all the pieces in place for that. And while you're doing that, start up casting and get every piece together to make sure that that movie is ready to shoot. And then Eon Productions made films on a pretty tight turnaround schedule between shooting and release that was admittedly pretty aggressive because they had an established team they could rely on. That team isn't there anymore. So to move aggressively on Bond 26 to get it out in the 2026 timeframe just seems borderline impossible to me. Obviously, nothing's impossible. Where there's a will, there's a way. And if people want to move on something aggressively and recklessly to just get something out the door, in some ways, it's just a matter of pressure and money. But I would say we're looking at a 2027 release for Bond 26. And I think the ramp up to the release of this movie is going to be huge. I think Amazon is going to treat this like a flagship blockbuster they've never done before, and we should all strap in because it'll be a huge multimedia event. What that means for the future of the series after that, depending on how Bond 26 is received, is anybody's guess. But I think Bond 26 is going to be the first time since Skyfall that a Bond movie has really felt entirely inescapable as a cultural object. And that's exciting. I think the worst case scenario for something like Bond 26 would be that it has this big rollout, but actually when it comes out, it's just kind of a lot of reheated Bond cliches without a lot of distinct character. Let's hope Bond 26 has some really distinct features in the mix there, regardless of whatever else is true of it, so that it's a film we want to watch, 15 years down the road from its release. But regardless of what the movie itself is, I would expect culture to just be saturated with the James Bond film rollout of Bond 26, because it's just going to be Amazon's first turn at bat, first turn to show that they know what they're doing, and they're going to make sure that all eyes are on Bond 26. My final takeaway here is, let's have fun. I, like many other fans, when I heard the news, my first response was nervousness. This is unknown territory. But a new Bond movie is a new Bond movie. And Bond was always going to continue to change and evolve. Like I said, Bond was going to start entering the public domain a little over a decade from now. And that was always going to change the face of what this character represented. So this changing landscape of what the film series represents came a little bit earlier than expected, but this sort of shift was going to happen one way or another at some point. And that is fine. The Bond series has always seen a lot of change. It's always seen a lot of different perspectives. And speaking as someone who is also a book fan, the book Bond has seen a lot of changes, a lot of different takes, a lot of different perspectives on who the character is, what his world is like. There's excitement in having more takes on Bond than not. And it's going to be really exciting to have a new Bond film to look forward to have Bond be the center of cultural conversation once again, especially given that when you really think about it, the last film that audiences rallied around as far as Bond is concerned is Skyfall. And that was well over, a decade ago, right? We are talking about a film that came out in 2012. So we're overdue for like a big Bond blockbuster experience. And I hope this is more of a door than it is a final hurrah. There are cautionary tales out there, the excitement everybody felt in the lead up to The Force Awakens and then the subsequent debates and then fizzling of fan enthusiasm for what that trilogy ultimately came to represent. I hope that's not the trajectory we're going to see with Bond here. I want Bond to really return in as fine a form as ever and establish what this character can be in the modern era. But we'll see. But regardless, I'm excited to start getting new news. I mean, we're going to have a lot to talk about for the next few years. And that's fun. And regardless of whether the movie is good or bad, that's not going to make or break us. The good movies that we love, the Bond movies that we love, they're not going anywhere. So we can keep those safe in the bank and hope for the best for Bond 26 and have fun with the journey, even if the destination ultimately underwhelms us, which it hopefully won't. So thank you for listening to my takeaways here on... thank you for listening to my take here on the Amazon takeover of the James Bond series. I look forward to hearing your comments. I'm sure you all have some very strong opinions on this news. And as always, I'll catch you in the next one.